Welcome, everyone. Hi, I'm Benjamin Singer.
And I'm Brittany Buford. And we're the co-hosts of Behind the Ballot, a new podcast about democracy reform on local, state, and national level. We've both seen injustice and how our democracy works and took steps to reform and improve democracy in areas close to us.
I run Show Me Integrity, a cross-partisan organization in Missouri working to create a more ethical, accountable, and representative government at federal, state, and local levels.
I'm a managing partner with Partners in Democracy, focused on democracy renovation that reconnects people with their civic experience and power and redesigns political institutions and civic infrastructures. This episode is episode 4 of Behind the Ballot. Today, we're talking with Todd Connor and Yinka Faleti about their experience and the important work of Veterans for All Voters. Todd is the co-founder and CEO. Yinka is the board president of Veterans for All Voters, an organization leveraging the collective strength of veterans to mend our broken political system. Hey, Todd. Hey, Yinka.
Hey, Brittany, great to be with you.
You as well.
So, Yinka and Todd, first of all, thank you for your service, both when you were on active duty and also with what you're doing to repair our republic with Veterans for All Voters. So we'd like to just start by hearing about you and your story. What brought you to this work as yourselves and as veterans, and your stories as it relates to getting started using the ballot initiative process itself? Yinka, do you want to start?
Wonderful. I'm happy to start. Yeah, and Ben, thanks to you and Brittany for hosting these conversations. We think it's so important. We think that we can be in a season of civic renewal, where there is a lot of anxiety as we, kind of stare down 3 weeks until election day, where we know that half the country is going to be dissatisfied the day after. We believe that we have to sort of stay the course and remind ourselves that we can facilitate a season of renewal amidst all of sort of the depressing conditions that we face ourselves in, the deteriorated conditions that we face as a country. So I hold that optimism. But to your question, my story is, having served in the Navy after college, gotten off of active duty. I pursued life as an entrepreneur. I got out of the Navy, went to business school, and did some corporate consulting, and then took a different path and started my own business. And then really had a heart and a passion for helping other military veterans find their way as entrepreneurs. So I spent about a decade building an organization called Bunker Labs that was just really committed to helping military veterans start and grow businesses, as well as military spouses, in communities across the country. And we scaled that to communities, 40 communities across the country. Deeply inspiring work, apolitical work, of course. And I was just reminded on a daily basis of the ingenuity, the patriotism, the kindness that is represented all across this country, at least in the military community, but I actually believe in every beyond the military community as well. And that was true whether I was in Sioux Falls or Washington, D.C., or Tampa, Florida, or Des Moines, Iowa. People coming together to pursue their dreams, start businesses, build up their local communities. And so in that season of optimism, which for me was a real privilege, frankly, to witness and to be a part of, you then had this kind of split screen about what we were seeing on cable news, the deterioration of our political construct, the polarization, the extreme behavior, things that would get you fired, from a job were suddenly being celebrated and rewarded for people running for president of the United States and positions of authority. And I just thought, this is so irresponsible, depressing, pathetic, choose your adjectives. And so the contrast for me was too much. And I really just, I wanted to figure out, as someone with some social capital, some being, sort of in this age cohort of middle age, having served in the military in uniform, feel like there's got to be a role to play. What is that role? And I think, Yinka can attest to this as well. When you take off the uniform, you don't unsubscribe to the oath that you swore. And so I really feel an obligation as an American, as someone who cares about this country, to intervene in this moment, and not intervene just in the Twitter sphere where you're just putting people on blast, finding a more productive way. So I spent 2 years in a learning journey, reading widely, listening to political theorists, trying to understand what's the system that is leading to these conditions. Why are we getting this behavior? Is it being rewarded or is it being discouraged? And it really just led me to this down the road towards election reform, and believing that the systems by which we choose our leaders are entirely determinative of the kinds of leaders that we get. And I'll kind of leave it at that. But that's what's led me into this journey, just this intellectual conviction where I wanted a thesis that I could really believe in, that felt to me like we wouldn't just solve the crisis of the moment, but that we would sort of put ourselves on a different path forward as a country, and to fix this political system, because the political system is not representative of the American people. It's a distortion. It's the worst version of America. America, at its core, is a country of people that agree more than they disagree, want to do the right thing. But our political system doesn't allow for that. So that's why I just got very animated about the work that we're doing, and we can talk more about what that looks like. But I'll kick it to Yinka to answer the same question.
Yeah, well, first of all, Benjamin, Brittany, it's terrific to be here with you this morning. Thank you so much for hosting us and giving us space to have this important conversation. You asked me to just share a bit about myself. Well, I've been fortunate to have worked in several professions over the course of my career, but my strongest identity is my first profession as this former Army officer. I served 6 years active duty, including 2 tours to Kuwait. The first when our old nemesis Saddam Hussein was around, and the second was in succession in response to September 11. After my Army career, I moved to St. Louis for law school, and then practiced both in private practice and as a state prosecutor. And from there, I went into nonprofit leadership, leading first at United Way of Greater St. Louis. And then I went on to lead as the executive director of the successor nonprofit to the Ferguson Commission. You'll recall that the Ferguson Commission was stood up in response to the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, actually 10 years ago. And after that work, I then ran for Secretary of State of Missouri. And in Missouri, Secretary of State controls all things voting, all things ballot initiatives, and making it easier to do business in a state. And then while I did not win Secretary of State, it was a phenomenal 21-month journey throughout Missouri. They got me to see people from all political walks, many, of course, Republicans and Democrats, many independents, people that were Green Party, Libertarian, people of all means, people of wealth and people of meager means. It was just a terrific journey, and learned so much, and really helped me to kind of take that next step. And in 2021, that's when I joined the work with Veterans for All Voters, and I came alongside Todd and then Eric Bronner, co-founder as well of Veterans for All Voters, and I joined as board president in that year. And my day job today is as a venture partner at Ascend Venture Capital here in St. Louis. My motivation for this work really flows from my experience running as a candidate statewide. When I ran, I got to see the dark underbelly, if you will, of our politics, not just at the state level, but nationally, and really seeing how voter suppression played out, the shenanigans, the treachery, the trickery, and more that were being used to suppress votes. But not only suppress votes of those that we traditionally think of being victims of voter suppression, people of color, students, elderly, but suppression of votes of independent voters, and the structures and strictures of our voting systems, particularly the primary election, have made independents victims of voter suppression as well. And we don't often think of them in that way, but that is the current state of our politics. And we have Missouri is what we call a semi-open primary state, but we have many states in the country that are closed primary states where you have to register with a political party to be able to vote in the primary election. And even in Missouri, that is semi-open, while you don't have to register with a party, you only get one ballot. You can only get a Republican ballot or a Democratic ballot. You cannot vote for any candidate that you want. And that to me is unsatisfactory. And so my motivation flowed out of a feeling that as a veteran, I deployed, and I and my brethren and sisters in the profession, Todd and so many others, our work was to ensure that all Americans could vote for whoever they wanted. And here we are defending democracy in countries like Kuwait and so many others, but we don't have full democracy in our own states here in the United States. And to me, that could not stand.
Thanks so much for that. I know in Yinka, you just mentioned it, as far as your brothers and sisters in the military go, and really having an onus of responsibility to step up and defend democracy. And that's part of why I love the mission statement of Veterans for All Voters. So I want to talk a bit about that. And can you guys kind of just tell us why it's important to really build and mobilize that community of veterans to advocate for these things, to advocate for election innovations, and to defend democracy?
Yeah, Brittany, that's a great question. And our mission is to really, let me start with our vision, actually, because I think that's more compelling. We envision a representative democracy, republic, in which citizens are, and these two words are really intentional, excited and incentivized to participate. The prevailing emotion leading up to November 5th is fear. It's fear. And the entire country is unified in fear. And we have a $12 billion political industrial complex that feeds off of fear, because nothing, we'll give a little bit of money to things that we love, but we'll get a lot of money if we think that our lives are on the line. And so fear really is the engine that drives campaign giving, that drives voter turnout, that drives mobilization. And we reject that. Fear should not be the motivation for how we choose our leaders. And so we envision, as a vision statement, a representative democracy in which citizens are excited and incentivized to participate. Excited to me means you can't wait to go to the polls because there's several candidates you're excited about. I mean, imagine this is a reality, because it is a reality in many areas of our lives. We go to the grocery store and might see, several flavors of chips, and we can't decide because, man, maybe I'll try the organic, and I hadn't seen these. This is the new flavor. I mean, we routinely do this when we go to the grocery store or go to a movie theater. But when it comes to politics, picking our leaders, we are so unaccustomed to choice and optionality. We are so accustomed to, I'm just very clear on who I don't want. And so I'm voting out of fear against the thing I don't want. That is just absolutely absurd. And we have to remind the American people that is absurd, that we should not be conditioned to think that is normal, that is acceptable. And so we stand up to say, we ought to envision a democracy in which we're excited and incentivized. Let's talk about incentivized. So excited to me means lots of candidates you think are great. And you're struggling actually to decide. Imagine that. Imagine a ballot in which you said, man, there's 4 people running for Secretary of State, and they're all pretty good, and I think I like Yinka a little bit more, but man, I think Brittany would be fantastic too. And she's got some different ideas. And I mean, imagine that, right? Just struggling at the ballot box because you can't decide amongst several candidates that you like. That is not a pipe dream. That is how it is in other countries. It's just not how it is here. So excited is an important word. Incentivized is a different word. And what incentivized really means is you feel like you have real power at the ballot. And anyone who's independent or third party does not feel like they have any agency through their ballot. And I could be a registered Democrat and still see that as a gross injustice. And people ought to have their views reflected. And what happens in the election reforms that we favor is you don't have to win the election to matter in the election. You know, if we're forcing candidates to figure out how to cobble together a coalition of the majority, it forces them to consider minority interests and to bring those ideas into their platform if they want to win. So we believe in election systems that incentivize candidates to reflect majority viewpoints and to find issues that matter to constituencies and to somehow bring those into the fold. That actually ensures robust representation. So those things to me ought to be prevalent in our politics, that we should be excited and incentivized, which in turn incentivizes better and different candidates to run for office. Everyday citizens, you know, increasingly, this is just a professionalized industry. The people that are coming into office have worked for other candidates. We don't, you know, get sort of local leading citizens running for office. It's increasingly an industrialized kind of political class. And we have to get beyond that. So those are our motivations. And then we can talk about the reforms that get us there. But it's really important because we don't start because we care about specific reforms. We start because we care about a vision of representative democracy in which all citizens are incentivized, in which their views matter, in which they feel represented, and in which they feel like they have real choices at the ballot. So that ought to be a shared aspiration. And if it is a shared aspiration amongst our friends, then we have to ask ourselves, do our election systems get us there? And the answer is just obviously no. So then the question becomes, well, then what do we need to do to get us there, right? Which is what leads us to the conversation about election reform. But Yinka, I defer to you on the question as well.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. You know, you asked Brittany why veterans, and for me, when I think about veterans, and I even distance myself, you know, I'm an Army veteran, but when I distance myself from the population and look at the population objectively, you know, veterans are people who just have a love of country. You're talking about a population, particularly when you look at the last couple of decades, who have sacrificed so much. Many veterans have, some have deployed and lost an arm to an IED or other incidents. Some have deployed and lost a leg. Under the old Army policy, when I was serving, you could not come home for the birth of your first child. So if you were having your first child and you happen to be in Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever this country sent you, you could not come home. I think the policy has since been updated. But I mean, many have lost relationships. Many veterans have lost their marriages because of the intense service to this country and other relationships. So you're talking about a population of people who are so vested in this country. And you're talking about a population that is more vested in country than in camp. And so when you talk about why veterans, this is the population that has to be involved if these reforms are to succeed, that has to be involved if this country is to get to a better horizon in terms of our politics. People who just sincerely care more about country than anything else and have given so much to this country. So to me, that's why veterans are so important to this movement. You know, 49% of veterans identify as independent. Nearly half of veterans do not affiliate with either of the two major political parties because they just care more about the country than about the camp. And so to me, that's just a compelling reason for veterans' engagement in this process.
Thank you, Yinka. You spoke so powerfully about how veterans are doing everything they can or did everything they can while on active duty to protect against existential threats to our people and our security. And now you all are doing what you can with these existential threats to our democracy. So Todd, you mentioned earlier that, you know, Veterans for All Voters isn't just about putting a statement out on Twitter. You're about actually doing some of the hard, concrete work to really fix these problems structurally. So let's get into the specifics. We understand Veterans for All Voters focuses on implementing really specific election innovations. 1, open primaries. 2, voting innovations. And we saw on your website that includes both ranked choice or approval voting. And 3, top 4 or final 5 voting. So why do you all believe these are the most important structural reforms that you all are working to make to our democracy right now, to make our democracy respect voters, as is the name of our National Respect Voters Coalition, and to respect the contributions and representation for our veterans and all voters in the political process?
Yeah. Yeah, no, our reform agenda is really centered around final 5 voting or final 4 voting. And it's a model in which there's a single unified primary, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, all running on one ballot. And the top 4 or 5, some states are approaching it differently, but the top 4 or 5 vote getters going to the general election, and then voters ranking their preferences and saying, I like this person second, this person at first and second and third, or they just say, this is the only person I like, and give them their vote. It's a simple system. It's been implemented in Alaska. And the results out of the last election cycle in 2022 in Alaska were profound. They were profound. Republicans and Democrats endorsing each other, increased representation by women and minority representation, the first Native Alaskan elected to Congress. And to be clear, people that moved beyond their party, Democrats that were more moderate than Democratic leadership would like, Republicans that were more nuanced than Republican leadership might like, and conservative Republicans finding common ground with progressive Democrats in some instances to move things forward in the state legislature. So if you dream of a world in which politicians put personalities aside and focus on policy making, it happened in Alaska. And you got serious politicians, the performative politicians that would rather be running takedown jobs on Twitter, they lost. And the ones that were ready to do the work and reach across the aisle and figure out what made sense for Alaskans, they won. So we have a lot of evidence from Alaska. There's a great film, Majority Rules, which really articulates this, if you want to watch the film. So we have evidence that this has gone live in one state. Alaska voters initiated this, got it done. And politicians, not surprisingly, or those that have had outsized power because they sit at the fringe, are not happy. They want to take the power back for themselves, away from the people, right? So there's predictable opposition. By the way, there is opposition where Democrats have strong control, like in Washington, D.C. It is the Democratic machine that is opposed to giving power back to people. And in other places, it is sort of the Republican establishment, but it really cuts across ideology. And it's just a really important thing to say, because I think there's a myth that this somehow benefits, one side or the other. It does not. It benefits people in the middle, and it hurts entrenched political power interests, right? So yeah, as it should. And that's exactly, we don't hide from the fact that it does do that. We think that's a good thing. So, final 4 voting or final 5 voting, we think has a lot of power. There are several ballot initiatives this cycle where voters are seeking to implement this model. Colorado, Montana, Idaho, Alaska is defending its model, Washington, D.C., and Nevada specifically. And then there's other ballot initiatives that are advancing things like the citizen initiative process, or open primaries, or ranked choice voting, or other election innovations that give power back to voters. So we stay flexible on solutions. I think the combination of open primaries and ranked choice voting is uniquely powerful. It ensures that you'll never have a lesser of two evil election. I don't like election models that only give you 2 choices. And we know that the California, what's called the jungle primary, that it leads to that, which I think can subject it to manipulation. And so I'll go back to the principles that matter to us. If there are other reforms that have opportunities of being implemented that deliver on the principles of choice, competition, representation, we'll support those where those opportunities exist. But it's a watershed moment this cycle, specifically because of the number of states that propose have proposed the Alaska model for implementation, and there's a lot of enthusiasm amongst voters and predictable opposition from entrenched political interests.
Yinka, did you want to speak to that at all?
No, I think Todd covered it really well. I'll add an anecdote that'll maybe put a little meat on the bones for those of us who are into basketball. This is one of my favorite times of year because the NBA season is about to begin, the college hoops season is about to begin, and when we think about basketball and all those who love basketball, the modern game did not used to be the modern game. Pre-1954, there was no shot clock. I mean, can you imagine that? There was literally no shot clock in the NBA, 1953, 52, 51, and so on. Teams would come down. If you had a 4-point lead in the fourth quarter, my goodness, you would just pass, dribble. And while all that passing, dribbling, and no shooting was going on, the stands were emptying out. The NBA was losing revenue. The game was getting boring. And the NBA said, hey, we got to do something different. And so in 1954, April, I believe, the NBA instituted the shot clock, the 24-second shot clock. And that ushered in the modern era. And so now the game picked up, it became faster, scores went up, fans returned. And what the NBA did was shift the incentives. And when you shift the incentives, you get a different result. And all of what Todd described in specific leads to shifting the incentives in our political system. You now have candidates when they are running who are not slinging mud at the other candidate because they, even if they're not your number one, they still want to be your number two. They still want to be your number three because if they get enough number one votes, number two votes, and so on, they can still win. And so they don't want to throw mud at your candidate because they want you to like them. We saw this play out with Mary Peltola in her election, as talked about. And so it shifts the incentives of cleaner campaigns. But once the candidates get in office, it shifts the incentives of what they actually get done. Because now there is no incentive to work for the broader swath of Americans. The incentive is to work for the extremes, the extreme right or the extreme left. And most Americans are not extreme right or extreme left. Most Americans are in that broader swath in the middle. And so the only way you can win under the systems that we propose is you work for the broader swath. And so like the NBA did in 1954, you change the incentives, you get a different result.
That's a great story that really brings it to life. And let alone the fact that, of course, in college hoops, you've got a Final Four system to help pick the best team. And I cannot agree more with what you both said about changing the incentives and moving towards positive campaigning for what works for the people, campaigning on policies and ideas instead of just the other person's worse than me, which is what we see so much. I know when we passed an open primary system in St. Louis through the ballot initiative process, and we had 4 candidates running for mayor, it was crazy. There was a live televised debate and they were saying nice things about each other, which is not what you usually see, certainly in the presidential primaries, for instance, where they're all attacking each other, ganging up on someone, ganging up on the front runner usually. And we saw the opposite in St. Louis, where they're all saying nice things about the front runner, because in St. Louis, that open primary system was using approval voting. So if I say nice things about Todd or Brittany or Yinka, your voters are also going to like me a little bit more and maybe also approve of me. And I have a better chance of moving to the general election. So there was a poll that one of our partners ran right after the election, and on a 3-to-1 basis, more voters said it was a more positive primary than they had experienced 4 years before. I don't know how often you ever hear that. Usually it's like, oh, this was the worst election. American politics is going down the toilet. We're doomed. And it was totally different experience. And now, like you said, Yinka, instead of campaigning to a little ideological faction in the general election, now we see candidates gearing up towards our next city election in early 2025, trying to make sure that they're doing things that most voters agree with instead of this one little political faction, things that actually improve quality of life for people and working together. Whether they like each other or not, they all know that they actually won a majority in their district or citywide, so they have to actually work together. So it's amazing what a difference these structural changes can make. I think people listen to us reformers and we sound like crazy idealists promising an impossible utopia, but we're seeing it play out in real life. So thank you for everything you're doing. Thank you for your service. Brittany.
Yeah, no, we talk about like incentivizing candidates. And on that flip side, we also need to incentivize citizens to really stay engaged and want to be involved in this process, right? You can only speak to those who will listen. So how do we keep citizens excited to participate? How do we ensure that they stay involved and actually care about the ballot measures and other election innovations that are ahead of us and in the coming election, some of which you mentioned, Todd?
Yeah, I think how do we get citizens engaged? I think it's reminding them that they have agency over the system as it has been built. And frankly, I think what motivated me and inspired me was the specificity of what we are proposing and the fact that it does not require Congress and does not actually have anything to do with the presidential election. You know, in some ways, the work that we're doing is hard, which is that we've got to go state by state and have conversation with the voters in states like Missouri and states like Nevada. But when you tell them that there is a specific path out of this kind of madness, that's inspiring. The specificity and the achievability of this is I think, inspiring. And I sort of respectfully disagree with friends and others that want to kind of frame this as a behavioral challenge. You know, how do we teach people to act nicely? You don't have to teach people to act nicely. If you change the incentives, they'll do it immediately. You know, and this is the thing that that Yinka was speaking to, and Ben, you've seen as well. If it doesn't help your reelection to be a jerk, you'll stop being a jerk. And it doesn't take months; it takes minutes. And so, you know, we've seen people, frankly, in the public consciousness, you know, politicians that have been around for decades who used to be different. Well, they've come to understand that their own reelection in this environment is contingent on sort of acting the fool. And so if that's what it takes, then that's what they're going to do. So I think if we have to move beyond behavioral approaches and instead look at the incentives, as you're saying, Brittany, around how does it work? You know, who's getting elected and why? And what I assure everyone is, take your worst offender. They're acting entirely rationally for their own self-interest. I mean, the people that are raising the most money in Congress are the ones that are the most sort of toxic, least interested in governing, least interested in co-authoring something with someone from across the aisle. But it's working for these folks. I mean, it absolutely is. And there's very few members of Congress who are worried about losing a general election. There are lots of them that are worried about being primaried. And being primaried is sort of the cardinal threat that hangs over every incumbent. And the only way you're going to lose a primary is by not being 100% pure to what the leadership of your party wants you to do. And that's no way to govern. So I think the inspiration comes from the fact that Alaska has done this. 5 states might do it. And we're getting real wins. And, you know, I like to paint a vision. In some ways, we had for ourselves a 5-year vision that we'd like to see 5 states implement final 5 voting. Because if you get 5 states that operate in this new election model, that's 10 US senators that fundamentally, we like to call them like, you know, the axis of adults who will go to the Senate and say, forget what the Republican talking point is, the Democratic talking point. What makes sense for the American people? And if we have even 10 US senators acting with that sort of question central to them, they will be the new power center in the United States Senate. It won't be Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer. It'll be the 10 people that we know always come together to ask themselves, what is in the best interest of the American people? And you don't have to get 51 senators to actually recreate the power structure of the United States Senate. 10 will do it. So we might get there this cycle. I mean, we could get there in November with you know, 5 states on their way towards implementing final 5 voting. And that would be a sea change moment that would start in the Senate, scrambles how the media talks about what happens there, scrambles the way the House votes, kind of re-engineers how the White House, is sort of forced to think about legislative policy. And from there, we give the American people evidence that the future can be different. And pretty soon, this is my theory, and I'd be curious Yinka's thoughts, but pretty soon, the other 90 in the United States Senate start saying, gosh, I'd like the freedom to be nuanced. I'd like the freedom to make substantive policy and not just be beholden to what my party, thinks I ought to do. I'd like some of the freedom that Lisa Murkowski seems to have in the United States Senate. And I think that we'll begin to see a tipping point where, a few states started the movement, but pretty soon every state is having a conversation about how it wants to do its own elections. And I don't think that that's a pipe dream. I think this is something that we could achieve in the next 4 or 6, 10 years. And that's what gives me inspiration.
I don't have much to add, but I want to put a fine point on something Todd said. When you don't need all 50 states, you need just a few change makers. Pick your U.S. senator, pick your villain, have that don't say it out loud, just keep it in your head, and then think about how that one person held up legislation, maybe shut the government down, maybe affected you as a federal employee or your spouse, or maybe a benefit. I mean, just think about how that one person impacted the lives of over 300 million Americans. Think about now what 10 U.S. senators can do. If one U.S. senator is extremely powerful, think about what 10 U.S. senators can do. And so that's the power of this reform that we're talking about.
That is powerful, and it's really exciting, and thank you for your work. So one question we have that I think would be instructive if this is folks' first time tuning in or, thinking about engaging in the ballot initiative process. Can you highlight, a few of the opportunities here in our polarized environment, and where you have, like you said, often, those in power, whether it's individual politicians or political parties that are looking out for their careers or their best, their financial interest, their power. How do you actually move? How are you able to move these things forward when you've got such powerful forces against you? How do you get these to qualify for the ballot and pass in this kind of environment?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, and I think when we, so much of this is giving people a different vision. We think that we're stuck with the current system because if let's say you're 30 years old, you were born 30 years ago, and the system has pretty much looked the way it was, the way it is today. But you'd have to go back all the way to the turn of the 20th century. If you're still around, you would know that we did not used to elect our U.S. senators. In the earlier 1900s, the U.S. senators were appointed by state legislators. And so, systems do change. But that system changed because the people agitated for it. I mean, can you imagine not being able to vote for a U.S. senator? I mean, that's unimaginable now. But early 1900s, late 1800s, that was the status quo. And so I think it's casting, and Todd touched on this earlier, but I think a big part of this is casting a new vision of what is possible and expanding the imagination of the voter. And in creating within that voter a new vision of what is possible with their vote and with their voice that they cannot imagine because they only know what they've known, which is a politics of voting for the lesser of two evils. I mean, every November, most Americans in this country, every 4 years, most Americans in this country are voting for the lesser of two evils. And when you cast a new vision of what's possible, I think that's when you begin to change things.
Yeah, and I would just add, yes, I mean, as Yinka said, we have to remind the American people that this is within our history. This is a tradition that we go through as a country every 70 or so years, in which that kind of the powerful build scaffolding to protect themselves, and then we the people have to kind of rise up and pull that down to reclaim power for ourselves. So this is cyclical, and if you understand American history and the cycles that we go through, these reforms are right on time. I mean, the progressive era was achieved exactly what Yinka said. We wanted to take power away from smoke-filled back rooms and give it back to voters. But power is clever, and incumbent power will kind of find clever ways to kind of protect itself. And we see that with gerrymandering. We see that with political party processes. We see that with antiquated election structures. And so we, the people, have to, as we have in our history, stand up and say, actually, the power belongs to the people. So there's a tradition of doing this in America, and we have to remind the American people that this is a tradition, in fact, and it's right on time. As is amending the Constitution. We have that as a vehicle. It's been dormant for a while, but historically with constitutional amendments, the American people remember, after a generation or two, that they have this as an instrument to change. And then typically in American history, there's a flurry of constitutional amendments that will come at once. So we have to remind the American people we can do this. And then on the question of how do you work within a political industry that arguably has a lot to lose? And I would say a couple of things. I'll quote Mr. Rogers and say, you find the helpers. That's the first thing you do. And there are amazing elected officials. We don't want to cast every elected official as self-interested politician. Many of them absolutely want to get there and do the right thing, but it's almost like the water they swim in. It's so hard to imagine a future in which they aren't sort of protecting against an attack in the primary from their base, right? Particularly when everything is framed as a binary choice, right? People just kind of fall in line. But there are absolutely elected officials who are exhausted. This is not why they came to Washington, D.C. This is not who they want to be. And they become champions for this work. But we don't need elected officials to do this. We need the American people to do this. And I wish every state had a ballot initiative process. As we know, only about half of the states in this country do. So it is harder in states where you have to work through a state legislature. But here's part of the irony of the reforms that we propose. Sometimes the deal in the state might be, we're going to ask the state legislature to change not the way that they get elected, but the way that the Congress gets elected. So in some ways you're saying, hey, you can stay safe, but we want to scramble the competition for those above you. And it's a little bit self-interested or cynical, because there are state legislators that say, yeah, I wouldn't mind my congressman having more competition, and maybe I'd like to be that competition. So these might be good reforms for the United States Congress. Part of what we know is when you give voters a taste of real competition and choice anywhere on their ballot, they quickly want it everywhere on their ballot, right? So our theory of change is, if you can get wins in communities, if you can get wins at the federal level, if you can get wins at the state level, get the wins wherever you can, because voters pretty soon realize, well, wait a second, I don't understand why I had 5 great choices for this state rep race, but I'm still stuck with, this kind of U.S. Senate election that feels like it's already in the bag, because we live in a blue state, and the general election therefore doesn't even matter. So that's part of the theory of the case that we're working on. And then in the ballot initiative states, you just go straight to voters. Just go straight, talk to voters and let them know it could be different. And that's where we're getting great wins, in spite of whatever entrenched political interests try to tell folks.
What an awesome theory of change. Thank you for sharing some of that perspective and vision. We're going to start moving towards closing this conversation. If you're watching this live on Facebook, I know we've got some folks viewing there and on Zoom. Feel free to drop some questions in the chat or in the Q&A. We're monitoring those. And while we see if anyone has any questions, I want to talk about the threats to the initiative process, which is that opportunity to take it straight to voters. So what are you all doing in the face of these legislatures that are trying to, essentially trick voters by placing measures on the ballot that would vote to get voters to take away their own power? Tell us about that.
Well, yes, the initiative process itself is under assault. And it's just, I think we just have to stop and just consider the irony of this, when citizens come together and say, actually, we want to protect reproductive freedom, or we want to legalize cannabis, or we want to we want there to be more competition. It is ironic when politicians, if they don't like the answers, choose to just ignore that or undo it, or ask themselves, how do we ensure that the next time citizens don't get a voice? I mean, that should just stoke collective outrage. And in California, for example, and other places, the process is non-binding. So even voters might come forward and have an overwhelming opinion on something, and the state legislature can just choose to ignore it and say, yeah, that's interesting, but that's not what we want to do. So, I think that there ought to be a mechanism. What's clear is the American people don't feel heard often enough, and they want a mechanism to be heard. And, the lesser of two evils, voting, isn't really a full expression of what the American people want. It's a mischaracterization. I mean, if you're forced to choose, if you serve me dinner every night and the choice is steak or salmon, and I hate fish, so I get steak every time, you might just think, oh, Todd loves steak. Actually, I'm a vegetarian, but I don't want to starve and I don't like fish. So I'm eating steak every night, and I think that's how a lot of the American people feel when it comes to their politics. So the citizen initiative process is absolutely going to be under threat. Politicians who are scared of voters being more involved, having more of a voice, are going to aggressively claw those things back. We just have to ask ourselves, is that who we want in charge? Elected officials who are fundamentally scared of what the American people want, and that ought to be a question that we ask people when they're running for office. Would you support citizens having a direct input on a pressing issue? And if not, why not? And that ought to bother us irrespective of the issue itself. That politicians wouldn't want input from the American people and from voters. And so I think we have to be loud about the implications of that, and fight the battle on the ground in states, which is where the battle is going to be fought at every turn that we can.
Yeah, Ben, just as something near and dear to my heart. So to kind of put a finer point on this, in Missouri right now, there is an amendment on the ballot, Amendment 7, that is wrapped in all kinds of sweet ballot candy. And this amendment is really about ranked choice voting. And we've talked about ranked choice voting as a means of democratizing voting for Americans all over the country, and here in Missouri. But the state legislature does not want ranked choice voting. And to be fair, it is any state legislature that is controlled by one party. I mean, this is the same case in New York, a state legislature that is heavily Democratic. And the same case here in Missouri, a state legislature that is heavily Republican. And so you have state legislatures wanting to limit the power of the people. And so they have put on the ballot Amendment 7, which is really about ranked choice voting and would forbid ranked choice voting in Missouri if passed. But it's wrapped in a ballot candy of the first part of the amendment that says only U.S. citizens can vote. Well, only U.S. citizens can vote now. But if you're not paying attention, you'll think that it's doing something special, and so you don't read on. So this is the danger of trickery and treachery in ballot initiative language, and the challenge for organizations like ours, Veterans for All Voters, and all organizations that are just in favor of greater competition, greater democratization of voting and innovation for the people, is that education and communication piece, educating the voting population as to these tricks, and educating and helping people see that they really do have the power to control these things, and they're not just victims of the status quo.
Thanks so much for that. Yeah, and it is kind of gives us a good transition, because we do have a question from someone that's watching. And you just mentioned a bit about almost self-interest when it comes to party lines, right, in the legislature. Um, John Glenn Jr. mentions that he has participated in advocacy, and he kind of finds that a lot of senators or representatives present as friends of veterans, he feels, but they tend to vote against bills that are primarily for the quality of life issues. And when it comes to veterans, in his view, he is finding that they often vote against their own interests because of a particular party, whether that is Democrat or Republican or independent. And so his question for the two of you is what can be done, or how do we go about making voting more visible, voting records in particular more visible, so that it can possibly help other people, other veterans, feel more comfortable and more informed in the decisions that they make as they lean into election reform?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. And thanks for your advocacy and what you're doing. There's a great organization on the Hill called With Honor that Ry Barkow leads, which is a bipartisan caucus of members of Congress that have served. And not everyone who's served is a member of the caucus, but they try to kind of advance bipartisan things that are supportive of veterans and their families. They were kind of chief architects behind the PACT Act and some other things. I would say a couple things. I mean, there absolutely has to be more transparency. Veterans are sort of a niche issue where everyone wants to, claim credit as for loving the vets, but we have to ask ourselves, what is actually in the interest of veterans and their families? By the way, I challenge friends on the left who self-identify as democracy advocates. You can't be a democracy advocate if you aren't advocating for the interests of registered independents. It cannot be a Trojan horse for just progressive policymaking. It has to be truly thinking about what does a healthy and representative election model look like. And by the way, that doesn't mean I win all the time. By the way, that means that there's compromise, and I don't win. But who wins all the time is the majority interest of the population. So specific to veterans, one of the most important things that the military community needs is stable leadership. They need to know that Congress is going to, and the president is going to engage in acts of war with the best interest of American, the American people and American national security. And it's hard to believe that that's happening when every vote is a straight party vote. It just immediately feels like this is not actually about what's in the best interest of America and our national security and our future, and instead sort of feels just partisan in nature. So the implications of political dysfunction are not ethereal. They're not just something, sort of in the future. It's not just about politics. It's actually about, do young people join the military because they have faith that the commander in chief is going to sort of act responsibly and serve the American people as a whole, as opposed to a party. It has real world implications today for whether senior military officers are getting promoted. It has real world implications today for how the NDAA gets constructed and passed. So there are tons of real world implications. And the challenge for the military active duty is they don't have the capacity to engage in politics. They don't have the ability to be loud about the current state dysfunction and the implications on the active duty personnel today. And so that's why, John, the advocacy you're doing is so important, because they need to be focused on being warfighters. We have to protect them from politics. But the dysfunction of our politics is so pervasive, and there are real world implications. I mean, that service branches missing their recruitment numbers in recent years. I can't help but see a through line to the political dysfunction. Who wants to go take an oath when you aren't confident that the Congress and the president are going to act in a way that is responsible, long-term oriented, post-partisan? I don't think that confidence is there. And I don't think young people are wrong for not having that confidence. So there's a whole set of things that need to happen, including and specific to military and veteran family policy. And our belief is you think about the lever of change that you want to operate at. I really think the most impactful upstream thing we can do is election reform, because then you get people acting like the axis of adults and advancing responsible policy. And then we get to do other reform minded things. Because when your own reelection is contingent on the majority interest, you're not scared of reform. All of a sudden, enacting a reform agenda helps your own reelection. So I think we could see a slew of responsible policymaking, and including and specific to the military active duty component, as well as military and veteran families. And to me, I kind of go back to, I think election reform, at least for my thinking, is the highest leverage point that I can find in this moment.
Well said. Thank you, John, for your question, and Todd for the answer. Yeah, wouldn't it be nice if instead of elected officials sometimes trying to hide what they're doing or obfuscate attacks on the people's power on the ballot, like Yinka talked about with Amendment 7 in Missouri, or hide their votes against quality of life for veterans, they were embracing the power of the people and incentivized to be transparent. Go ahead.
And Benjamin, let me just say one other thing on this, because it's a really important point. Sadly, there are lots of elected officials who want to be for an issue, but don't ever want to take a vote on it. And there's lots around veteran policy, that John, I think you're alluding to. Lots of folks, they want to be for something, and then they pray it never gets to a vote because they don't actually want to see it become law, or they don't actually want to have to be held accountable to it. And so there are not a lot of votes. I mean, we've had one of the most least productive Congresses in recent years because productive policymaking is kind of ground to a halt. Alaska, by the way, their last cycle had one of the most productive policy sessions, enacting tons of policy that was good for Alaskans. So there are not a lot of votes, frankly, being taken that aren't just straight party, and that's part of the problem. So there ought to be more of a record. There ought to be things that are presented as good ideas ought to get quicker to the floor for votes, even if they lose. But let's get people on record, create that paper trail, create that transparency, accountability, because too many politicians, frankly, like to keep the problem, because the problem is more helpful for their own reelection than the actual solution, and that's again just endemic of why our election systems are just completely failing us in this moment.
Absolutely. Well, before we wrap up, Yinka, Todd, it has been an honor chatting with the two of you today. Thank you again for your service to our country and for the amazing work that Veterans for All Voters is doing in America. So how can folks get involved and follow you with Veterans for All Voters?
Well, I'll answer that, and then I'll give Yinka the final word. Find us at veteransforallvoters.org. Join your state chapter. We have volunteers in 48 states, including the District of Columbia, which has Proposition 83 on the ballot this November. Join us. Make your voice heard. Stand up. And when you join us, we bring you into monthly conference calls. We educate you on what these reforms are. We encourage you to get locally involved, figure out what's going on. And what I've seen, and this is just a huge source of inspiration, is individuals absolutely make the difference. Nick Coe, Mike Cantwell are bringing election reform to Charlottesville, Virginia. Mike Escobar is the face of the reform campaign in Nevada. It is individuals who are moving the ball forward in states across this country. So don't believe that an individual can't matter. In fact, it is the thing that does. So please do get involved with us, and we're having a lot of fun as well. And stay optimistic because things can change. But don't anchor on the wrong thesis. Don't hope for a miracle. Get focused on things that can happen. And election reform is having a moment. There's opportunities across the country, and the more you know, the more inspiring it is. So Yinka, I'll give you the final word, my friend.
Yeah, and I'll be brief. I know we're short on time. So Todd has said it. Go to our website. It's in the chat there, and join the organization. We have a monthly all hands that you can also join in. So, and we have a newsletter we send out. Lots of ways to get engaged, as much or as little as you want. But it reminds me of this anecdote. We've all heard it. There's a young girl on the seashore, and there are a bunch of seashells. and she's tossing them one by one into the sea. And then an old man comes along and says, "Hey, what are you doing? I mean, there are like thousands of them. What, like, you can't make a difference." And she says, "Well, that one I just tossed in the sea, I made a difference for that one." And I think that's how it is with our politics sometimes. We get so discouraged. We think we can't change this thing. It's just impossible. There are like thousands of problems in our politics. But as Todd said, when we want to make change, there is a high lever. This is the high lever. This does not fix everything, but it makes everything else easier to fix. And so join us at Veterans for All Voters. We're so excited to have you in this work.
Thanks so much. To all of you who are listening, if you're listening, watching, if you want to join this movement, definitely join Veterans for All Voters, but also you can join Respect Voters. You can sign up at respectvoters.org, donate, volunteer. Feel free to help us protect and use the initiative process to renovate our democracy. We are growing fast and we're super excited for the road that's ahead. So thanks so much. This is Brittany Buford. And that's Benjamin Singer, who is on.
And Benjamin Singer signing off from behind the ballot, reminding our leaders to respect voters.